I'm recording this in August of 2019, which means we're just a little over 2 months removed from the marking of the 75th year since the D-Day invasion of Western Europe that helped tip momentum in World War II towards the Allied powers. I'd like to say that was the reason why I chose this book, but no, this was literally just a random happenstance. Also, the book we're covering today was released in 2012, so it really didn't even tie into any type of anniversary. Now, there have been comics before that depicted important figures and events throughout history. Heck, when I was a kid, I remember reading these little digest comics that were biographies of people like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Ulysses S. Grant, and, for some reason, Andrew Johnson. Of course, I would also be remiss if I didn't mention the recent series of graphic novels by Congressman John Lewis, which covers the civil rights movement. However, those historical comics were a little different in that they played out more like, say, movies or plays or TV shows. Giving the idea of the events that were taking place, but, maybe not getting every exact detail nailed down. They were more dramatic interpretations of the events. Today's story, Normandy, plays more like, say, a news documentary. It's very exhaustively detailed from everything associated with D-Day, from the planning stages all the way to Charles de Gaulle arriving in Paris and liberating the city. So with that, let's start Normandy, a graphic history of D-Day. By early 1944, the Axis powers were losing most of the momentum in the war. The Russian and Italian fronts had fallen, and Allied bombers were beginning to cripple the German military-industrial complex. Still, the Allied forces knew that to truly win the war, they would have to take out the Atlantic wall the Axis had built up along the north and western coast of France. Plans to attack the wall were first formulated in 1942 when the first American soldiers touched down in Britain. As planning went on, the Soviets ratcheted up the pressure as their forces were being exhausted on the Eastern Front. There was an invasion attempted in August of 1942 at the French village of Dieppe, but it was a complete failure. However, victory can be learned from failure, and the British General Sir Frederick Morgan began developing Operation Overlord. There were two likely points of attack. The obvious was Pas de Calais, the narrowest point in the English Channel between Britain and France. In fact, Pas de Calais was so obvious that it was the most heavily fortified point of the German forces. That would leave option number 2, the Normandy coast near the port city of Cherbourg. If the Allies could capture that point, it could act as a supply hub for further fighting into Europe. By December of 1943, General Dwight David Eisenhower was appointed to head up the Allied invasion force. Eisenhower then appointed Bertram Ramsay, Arthur Tedder, and Bernard L. Montgomery to head up the naval, air, and ground forces for the attack, respectively. The last appointment proved to be rather surprising, as Montgomery was one of Eisenhower's biggest detractors. However, Montgomery had thwarted one of the highest-ranked officers in the Axis powers, Johannes Erwin Eugen Rommel, the Desert Fox, who had just been transferred to the Western Front. Rommel was well aware of the invasion plans and immediately set out to reinforce the German strongholds in Normandy. Meanwhile, 2 American generals were appointed to unique positions. Omar Bradley was to lead all American land forces for the invasion, while George S. Patton was to plan a phantom invasion of Pas de Calais to distract the Axis army. Patton was chosen for his position because it seemed that he was the officer most respected by the German High Command. However, the reason why he was appointed to the Phantom Army was because he had been severely reprimanded twice for striking enlisted soldiers who were suffering from battle fatigue. The where, who, and how for the invasion were set. Now all that was needed was a when, a time and a date. Certain conditions were needed. A late rising moon for an airborne incursion, low tide at dawn for the amphibious vehicles, and decent weather with a low wind for navigation. It seemed like the universe was conspiring against the Allies, as the ideal date of May 1st had to be abandoned due to production issues on some of the landing equipment. Then in early June, the rains came in hard, and any further delay would probably provide too much time for the Germans to prepare. Finally, Chief Meteorologist J.M. Stagg predicted that there might be a small window of 36 hours in the afternoon of June 5th to the evening of June 7th. After consulting with the 101st Airborne Division, Eisenhower decided that June 6, 1944 would be the day of the attack. The airborne divisions were needed to secure exit roads for the 5 landing beachheads. That's Utah, Gold, Sword, Juneau, and Omaha. Alongside several bomber planes who were needed to take out German supply hubs, these were the first wave of the invasion of D-Day. Unfortunately, while the weather was decent, it was far from perfect, as many of the paratroopers landed off course. A few landed in the town center of St. Mary-Église, which quickly attracted enemy attention. Thankfully, backup came in the form of a battalion led by Colonel Ben Vandervoot, who broke his ankle when he landed and managed to somehow still take the town. The weather wasn't the only problem, as Rommel, anticipating the opening air incursion, lined several of the hedgerows that dotted the French countryside with barbed wire fence posts, which clipped the wings of several gliders. One of the few successes was the German gun battery at Merville, which the British 6th Airborne, led by Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway, managed to take down. 10 minutes before dawn on June 6th, the fleet launched from Britain, being led by a wave of B-26 bombers who needed to take out several turret bunkers along the coast. They didn't really do their job very well. Land forces made fall at Utah Beach, thanks mainly to an amphibious tank pushing their landing bridge the rest of the way. However, General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. then realized that they had landed at the wrong point of the beach. Still, they had no choice but to alert back up to the new location and press on. Somehow, they managed to accomplish this task with only 20 soldiers being killed and 200 being wounded. On the other hand, things weren't going nearly as well at Omaha Beach, where the amphibious tanks were sunk by high seas, forcing many to ford through the mine-laden waters to get to shore. Likewise, the unbombed turret bunkers were able to easily take out the ones who did make it to shore safely. The British encountered the strongest resistance at the town of La Hamel at Gold Beach. However, they managed to break through thanks mainly to a mine-sweeping tank, and a group led by Sergeant Major Stanley Hollis then took out 2 of the strongholds, capturing 20 prisoners in the process. At Juno Beach, the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division actually got blown off course and had their landfall getting delayed, though with only a few casualties. They eventually met up with the British fleet and took the town of Bernier-sur-Mer, and then moved on to the city of Cayenne. The waning hours of the day saw a war between the German Panzer tanks and British Sherman tanks. The Brits managed to overwhelm the Panzers, destroying 8 of them, leaving them 3 miles outside of Cayenne. Back at Omaha, forces slowly and surely began to gain ground, ducking through barbed wire and scaling cliffs. Still, they only made 1 mile in by nightfall, with 2,500 dead, wounded, or missing. It's here they begin to move on to later battles of the invasion. And due to time constraints, unfortunately, I did have to omit a lot of this. I'll get into explanations why later. Having established enough of a foothold to open up a port for supplies, the Allied forces press on. However, it wouldn't be too long before they encountered a new obstacle in the form of the hedgerows, which normally in England and the United States are used to denote property lines between farms. However, in France, the bocage, as the locals called it, crossed farmlands all willy-nilly. The thickets were just large enough for troops and in some cases small tanks to hide in for an ambush. In one instance, a German battalion got the jump on sleeping Allied troops. Things weren't running smoothly for the Axis, however, as Der Fuhrer still believed that the real invasion would be at Pas-de-Calais and refused Rommel's repeated request to transfer troops away from that point. Even when a few panzers could get transferred away, they wound up being attacked by Allied bomber planes, so any movement had to be done at night. The bombing got so bad the Germans attempted to conceal their tanks by covering them with shrubbery. It was at this point that General Montgomery elected to try to take the city of Cayenne. Unbeknownst to Montgomery, the German panzers in the area were captained by a master strategist named Michael Wittmann. Wittmann used the hedgerows to conceal his small Tiger tanks and launched sneak attacks against 4 British tanks. It was enough for Wittmann to lead his crew back into Cayenne, where he took out another tank just as reinforcements arrived. At the end of the day, 27 British tanks were destroyed, and much of their attack front was also gone. The next day, the Brits set up an ambush of their own, slipping back into Cayenne and waiting while Wittmann and his crew were out on patrol. When they returned, the tanks were attacked and Wittmann's personal tank was blown up. Meanwhile, Rommel and his fellow higher-ups met once more with the Fuhrer in order to plead to get him to transfer forces from Pas-de-Calais. And they got the exact same response. Sorry, internet law commands it. As this was happening, the Allies managed to use their bombers to take out the defensive complex in Cherbourg, though not before the German forces, under orders, rendered all of the port almost entirely unusable. It took 3 weeks to get almost everything functional. Down south, the Allies struggled to take over more of the supply routes, as that was the responsibility of most of the decimated forces from Omaha Beach. Replacements were slow to move in, and the ones who did arrive weren't exactly being welcomed warmly. Slowly but surely, though, the forces began to amass properly. Back at Cayenne, a new threat arrived in the form of the Jugend, or youth forces. Trained from youth in military strategy, the group consisted of 16 and 17-year-olds and was one of the most fiercely brutal regiments. They got the jump on some Canadian forces, and even though they were outnumbered, the battle was more of a seesaw affair. The Allied High Command then began strategizing on ways to maintain control over Cayenne while also trying to overtake another city, St. Louis. They also managed to find a way to take out the hedgerows. However, the Germans tried a little sneak attack of their own and wound up destroying much of St. Louis before the Allied forces even arrived. Back at Cayenne, the British landed a unique victory as a plane spotted Rommel's jeep as the general was mounting forces for another attack. A few shots later, and Rommel was wounded so badly that he could no longer serve in the field. After that, several bomber planes dropped their payload onto Cayenne. The attack did even more damage to the panzers, with several crew being driven to suicide from the constant noise. With British tank forces rolling in, Colonel Hans von Luck was forced to organize things on the fly, even going as far as to hold a pilot at gunpoint until his anti-aircraft plane was converted into an anti-tank plane. Von Luck lay in another ambush with his remaining tanks, which allowed the battle to be a stalemate for a few hours. This slowed the supply lines down enough to become easy targets for the Luftwaffe. A thunderstorm then came in, halting all movement. Still, General Montgomery tried to claim victory as most of Cayenne had been taken. His superiors didn't really agree with him. As for Rommel, well, he got caught up in a plot to assassinate der Fuhrer and elected to take his own life rather than be executed. Opinions on the assassination attempt swayed, with many of the Jugend being upset and others just kind of keeping quiet. With advancement being slowed to a standstill, the Allies tried one final push by sending most of their tanks against the panzers. This began to weaken the German front. It was then that General Patton came through, with most of his focus being on the panzers and leaving infantrymen for later. This was enough to begin causing the German front to collapse. The Germans mounted one final counterattack on the town of Mortain. However, General Bradley conceded the town and chose to push towards Paris instead. Along the way, they managed to take out several German supply lines, and this was enough for Patton's group to break away and provide backup to the forces in Mortain, driving the Germans out. Still, they couldn't withdraw from all of France. As this was happening, Allied forces that were stationed in Naples crossed the Mediterranean and invaded the south of France. The Allied forces continued pressing onward, with Rommel's replacement von Kluge being relieved of duty and taking his own life. Von Kluge's replacement didn't fare much better, as the Germans had to deal with a contingent of Polish escapees who had joined up with the Allied forces, taking out another key supply line. On August 19, 1944, the Parisian gendarme took over control of the police department in the name of the Republican Charles de Gaulle. The French and Communist resistance then began working together to drive out the German troops. German General Dietrich von Cholitz disobeyed direct orders to set the capital ablaze, and instead used the Swedish ambassador to negotiate passage for Charles de Gaulle and his forces into the city. On August 25, 1944, Allied forces entered Paris alongside Charles de Gaulle, and the French were finally free. And that concludes Normandy, a graphic history of D-Day. How was it? Well, admittedly, I am kind of a touchy subject zone, so I want to preface this by saying I have nothing but the utmost respect and dedication for all of the people who served in D-Day and everyone who gave their lives especially. So it's not that I'm trying to belittle you at all by saying these things. Overall, the story was very richly detailed and pretty well nuanced, and there was some pretty decent artwork in there. That's where the compliments end, unfortunately. The pacing in this story is just horrendous. This is 96 pages long, but it feels like 500, and not in a good way. It's way too slow. There's no dialogue in this. I think I would have really helped move things along a little bit. Instead, it's just these kind of caption panels describing everything, and it's really tedious. It's just not good. And if you recall, last year I reviewed a movie called First Man, which was about Neil Armstrong and landing on the moon, and kind of the same thing with that the film was just so clinical, and this book is the same way. It's very clinical and detail-oriented. There's no personality, and because of that, it really lacks a lot of drama. Drama about D-Day. I mean, you made D-Day boring. Also, it's just really bogged down in minutia. I mean, we spend so much time bouncing between panzer attacks in Cayenne and the dangers of the hedgerows. We fix the hedgerows, and then suddenly we're going back to the hedgerows and how dangerous they are. And it's like, all due respect, I got sick of the hedgerows about the sixth time they got mentioned, okay? Again, like, I'm not trying to belittle anything of the events that happened on that day, but this just isn't very good. There are better interpretations of D-Day. The Longest Day, both the novel and the movie, are much better. Just go with those. I have to give Normandy, a graphic history of D-Day, a D. And with that, let's see what we're doing next time on the Random Trade Review. Hey guys, got a request for the show? Check out my Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimeforcatproductions. And if you like the video, give it a like, share it, subscribe, and ring that notification bell.